The watchtower stood tall and alone on the mountain ridge, a solitary guardian of the forest below. It was built decades ago, and every summer, a fire lookout was stationed there to watch for smoke, the first sign of a fire in the dry, pine-covered wilderness. For the most part, the job was quiet, even peaceful. But every now and then, things would happen that couldn't be easily explained. Jason, a seasoned fire lookout, had taken up his post at the watchtower for the past 5 years. He enjoyed the solitude, the escape from the noisy life of the city. But this summer, something was different. From the moment he arrived, he felt an uneasy tension in the air, as if the forest itself was whispering secrets he wasn't meant to hear. The first night in the tower, Jason heard a low hum, barely perceptible over the rustling of the wind through the trees. At first, he thought it was the tower settling, but the sound persisted, rising and falling in rhythm, like distant chanting. When he stepped out onto the deck to listen closer, it stopped. Jason shrugged it off, blaming his tired mind. Over the next few days, the hum returned, always just out of reach, and always stopping the moment Jason tried to find its source. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness swallowed the forest, Jason decided to investigate. He grabbed his flashlight and headed down the narrow, creaky stairs of the tower, his boots crunching against the gravel path below. He wandered deeper into the forest, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the thick shadows of the trees. The hum grew louder, but it seemed to be coming from all directions at once, like the forest itself was vibrating with the sound. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to pinpoint the source, but it was as elusive as ever. Suddenly, he heard a whisper. Not the wind, not the hum, but a distinct voice, low and breathy, calling his name. Jason, it sighed, sending a chill down his spine. He spun around, shining his flashlight wildly through the trees, but there was no one there. Just shadows and silence. Jason's pulse quickened as he stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a gnarled root. The whisper came again, closer this time. Jason, it repeated, a mocking tone lacing the sound. Panic set in as he sprinted back to the tower, slamming the door shut behind him. He leaned against it, breathless and shaken. For the rest of the night, Jason kept the lights on, the radio crackling softly in the background. He didn't sleep, he couldn't. The whisper had felt too real, too close. As dawn broke, he ventured back outside, hoping to find some rational explanation for what he had heard. But there were no footprints, no signs of anyone, or anything, near the tower. Days passed without incident, and Jason began to relax, convincing himself that it had been a figment of his imagination, a trick of the mind in the isolation of the wilderness. But one night, as he scanned the horizon for smoke, something caught his eye. Far off in the distance, just beyond the tree line, he saw a faint, flickering light, fire. Jason's stomach clenched as he reached for his binoculars, focusing on the source of the light. But as he adjusted the lenses, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a fire, it was a figure, standing perfectly still, holding a lantern. The figure was cloaked in darkness, its features obscured by the shadows, but Jason could feel its gaze piercing through the binoculars, staring directly at him. Jason lowered the binoculars, his hands trembling. When he looked again, the figure was gone, the light extinguished. He scanned the forest frantically, but there was no sign of anyone. He spent the rest of the night on high alert, eyes darting from the window to the radio, waiting for any sign of the mysterious figure. The following night, the lantern appeared again, closer this time, just at the edge of the clearing that surrounded the tower. Jason watched, frozen in place, as the figure slowly raised a hand, pointing directly at him. He stumbled backward, nearly knocking over his chair, as the radio crackled to life. Jason, the voice hissed through the static, echoing the whisper he had heard in the forest. He grabbed the radio, fumbling with the dials, but the voice continued, growing louder and more distorted. Jason, come down. Jason bolted out of the watchtower, flashlight in hand, and ran into the forest, not knowing where he was going, just needing to escape the voice, the figure, the lantern. The hum returned, louder and more dissonant, filling his ears with a painful ringing. He ran until his lungs burned, his legs shaking beneath him. When he finally stopped, he realized he had no idea where he was. The tower was nowhere in sight, and the forest loomed around him, dark and uninviting. He was lost, the hum still reverberating in his skull. The whisper came again, louder than ever. Jason, this way, it beckoned, and against his better judgment, Jason followed. He stumbled through the trees, the whisper guiding him deeper and deeper into the wilderness, until he reached a clearing he had never seen before. In the center of the clearing stood the figure, lantern glowing softly in the darkness. Jason approached cautiously, heart pounding in his chest. As he drew closer, the figure lifted its head, revealing hollow, empty eyes that seemed to bore into his soul. Jason opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stepped forward, reaching out with a skeletal hand. Jason turned to run, but his feet felt like they were stuck in the ground, roots winding around his ankles, pulling him down. The lantern flickered, the light growing brighter and brighter until it was blinding. Jason squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. But when he opened them again, he was back in the tower, the morning sun streaming through the windows. He blinked, disoriented, as he looked around. Everything was as it had been. No sign of the figure, no lantern, no whisper. Just the peaceful quiet of the forest and the distant call of a bird. Jason rubbed his eyes, wondering if it had all been a dream, some vivid hallucination brought on by isolation and stress. But as he stepped out onto the deck, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. On the railing, scratched into the wood, were the words, "I'm still watching." Echoes in the wind. Sarah was new to the job, having recently signed up as a fire lookout to escape her hectic city life. She had heard stories from the veteran lookouts about strange things that sometimes happened in the forest, but she dismissed them as tall tales, meant to spook the newcomers. Her first few weeks were uneventful, filled with quiet days of scanning the horizon and peaceful nights under the stars. But one night, as she sat on the deck, sipping her coffee and gazing at the moon, she heard it, a faint cry carried on the wind. At first, she thought it was an animal, maybe a coyote or a fox. But the sound came again, clearer this time. It was a voice, a human voice, calling for help. Sarah jumped up, her heart racing. She grabbed her binoculars and scanned the forest, looking for any sign of movement. But the trees were still, bathed in moonlight, and there was no one in sight. She radioed the ranger station, reporting the cry she had heard. They promised to send someone to check the area, but as the minutes ticked by, the voice grew louder, more desperate. "Help me, please," it pleaded, echoing through the night. Unable to just sit and wait, Sarah decided to investigate. She grabbed her flashlight and a flare gun, just in case, and made her way down the tower. The cries continued, guiding her through the dark forest. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the trees and reverberating in her ears. As she ventured deeper, the cries turned into sobs, heart-wrenching and full of despair. Sarah's pulse quickened, and she called out, "Hello? Where are you?" But there was no response, just the continuous sobbing, leading her further into the woods. The path grew narrower, the trees closing in around her. The sobs were louder now, almost right beside her, but she couldn't see anyone. Panic set in as she spun around, trying to find the source of the cries. Her flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced among the trees. Then, suddenly, the sobbing stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing in on her from all sides. Sarah stood frozen, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She listened, straining to hear anything over the pounding of her heart. But there was nothing, just the rustling of the leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Sarah turned to head back to the tower, but the path she had taken was gone. She was surrounded by dense trees, all looking the same, and she realized with a sinking feeling that she was lost. She pulled out her compass, but the needle spun wildly, unable to find north. As she tried to get her bearings, she heard it again, a faint whisper, like someone was right behind her. She whipped around, shining her flashlight into the darkness, but the beam only